Hello and welcome to week 4 of the Icon Leadership Podcast, season 4. I am Justin Anderson, the lead pastor of Icon Church, and I am here with Josh Searcy. Josh, say hi.
Hi.
That's it?
That's it.
That's all you got? Okay, wow. Okay, I guess I'm carrying this
I'm following orders, man. Hi.
We are in season 4, as I said, and this whole season is about mental health. So we are recording this in the middle of November 2020, and it is rainy and dark. And on top of all that, we are in the middle of another wave of COVID. So we just got put on lockdown again. And man, there is not a lot of light anywhere, let alone at the end of the tunnel. And so a season about mental health comes at a really good time. So we have talked thus far already about anxiety. We've talked about shame. And today we are talking about isolation. And we're doing this whole series because we believe that mental health is a very serious, very real, epidemic seems maybe strong, but maybe not.
Yeah,
it's a pretty serious thing happening in our country before COVID. Yep. Let alone what the last 9 months or so have done to people. And we think that it impacts leadership in particular. And so for those of you out there who are leading at Icon, you are leading at another church, you are leading in your work, in your school, whatever the context, that mental health has certainly affected either you as the leader or those around you. And so we want to equip you with the ability to be able to identify and then speak to each of these different mental health issues. So today we're talking about isolation, and that might not spring to mind when we think of mental health issues, right? Isolation probably doesn't make many of our lists. So that's one thing I want to discuss. But man, isolation has never been more relevant than it has been for the last 9 months of 2020. So Josh, talk to me a little bit about why we're talking about isolation.
Yeah, so isolation, you're right, isolation in itself is not a mental health issue, but it can be either a consequence or a catalyst for it. And so whether we're experiencing mental health issues and we feel like we have no option for like meaningful relationship with other people, we begin to isolate, and that kind of becomes a consequence. Or in this season of 2020 and the experience of isolation that we've all had, it becomes a catalyst for it. That's the reason why it's so difficult this year, is because we've been isolated. Even if we haven't been like physically isolated in our basements, we've been mentally and socially isolated for a really long time. So it's really caused a lot of issues. And really, I think it's, I'd love to kind of hear your experience, because you recently had to isolate in your own basement. And just was curious what that experience was like for you as a person, and then maybe as a leader. How did that feeling kind of affect you?
Yeah. So I tested positive for COVID-19 a couple weeks back. The rules that I had to follow was to isolate for 10 days. About halfway through that 10 days, my wife actually tested positive as well. And so then I was freed from the basement because there was no way we were going to parent 5 kids, both of us isolating. Lily, my 12-year-old, is strong, but she's not that strong. So I experienced isolation. My actual COVID-19 symptoms were relatively mild. It was a day or two of being tired and headache and those kinds of things. So I have joked, but it's really not a joke, that my primary symptom was severe basement fatigue. And that was tough. I mean, it was claustrophobic, not in a physical sense, but in a relational sense, where it just was like, golly, I'm so disconnected from my kids, which was super hard. I mean, just to stay away. I got tired of telling my kids to go away. But I would say our team, relevant to this podcast, our team, those 10 days that I was away from the team were really hard, because there were moments where we would have a staff meeting or some sort of Zoom meeting with 3 or 4 people, and it was obvious that one or more people were not engaged for one reason or another. And I didn't have the ability to easily follow up with those people, to kind of just do the relational. You realize how much relational communication is done nonverbal. That gets totally lost in a Zoom situation. So I think the isolation affected my leadership in a number of different ways. It made me feel like I had lost a leadership appendage almost, that I was fighting one-handed. And that was pretty tough. So that was my experience. But we're not just talking about isolation when you have COVID, right? I mean, we're talking about forced isolation, but also chosen isolation, right? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, isolation in 2020, it's easy to go ahead and just think of COVID related isolations, but we've been isolating ourselves mentally, emotionally, relationally for a lot longer than 2020. And so I think isolation is a lot of times self-inflicted. And so what I mean by that is there's a few different ways that we begin to isolate out of our own choice. And so one would be, as a leader, just a lack of trust for our colleagues because of past failures. The more that we have experiences with coworkers and with colleagues, and even for those who are under us in our leadership, the more experience we have of their failures, we can begin to take that and begin to think, okay, I genuinely cannot rely on anyone but myself. So because of that, I'm going to move away, even if I'm not physically distanced from these people, physically isolated. I'm going to take away my relational capital from the table. I'm going to isolate in my mind, in my emotions, and in my work. And so we begin to not trust those around us. And so we isolate. And then the other one I would say is just selfish standards for what work relationships look like, and just relationships in general. There's, the old church fathers had this Latin phrase to describe what human beings are, and homo inse incurvatas, which means the inward curving of the human soul, that we were made to reflect outward to the world what God is like. But at the fall, we curved inward, and we became almost fundamentally selfish creatures. Every standard that we've set up for relationships comes through that filter of selfishness, because we're so inwardly curved. And when that happens, no one's going to meet those standards very often. So we just isolate ourselves. Or, finally, it's isolation can be a kind of a throwing in the towel because of other mental health issues. We feel like, to connect it maybe to shame is, I don't have the option for a relationship of meaning and depth and vulnerability because I am this way, kind of like what we talked about. So because I am this way, that means I gotta isolate. I gotta punt on this relationship.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's some fairly straightforward, obvious implications of this, right? You have colleagues that you don't trust, therefore you pull back from them. But you can't lead a team of people that you're pulled back from.
Totally.
So then it gets in this chicken and egg kind of, or snowball situation, right? Where you pull back from a team, therefore you can't lead them, therefore they're not led, therefore they revolt. It's like now you're isolated because they all ran away from you, right? But what are some other implications for how isolation affects our leadership?
I think specifically isolation obviously kills the possibility of collaboration. And so if I'm doing it myself, if I can only trust myself, then there's no option to collaborate with coworkers, with colleagues, with those who are under my leadership. I can't get their opinion in on any given situation. And that is a huge hindrance to our leadership and to whatever we're leading, because collaboration is an engine for breakthrough. When we feel stuck, like even for me, if I'm in community groups, or specifically when I'm trying to think through a sermon, if I feel stuck, the first thing I have to do is talk to someone and ask, hey, I'm thinking about this, or this is the way I'm thinking about this text. How do you think about it? And just begin to almost get out of my head and get someone outside of me to kind of come in and give an opinion or something like that. And so isolation kills that. It narrows our vision, whereas collaboration really broadens our horizons for what is possible.
Mm.
Isolation just kind of narrows what is possible. And so, kind of like what you just said, and as soon as we have a lack of breakthrough because of our isolation, it only furthers our desire to hide and isolate. We constantly believe that we're alone in the fight, and this isolation in our leadership is just death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. Well, there's like a flip side to, the lack of trust thing is an over exaggeration or overestimation of our own ability.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't trust the people around me is also saying, I really trust me.
Mm-hmm.
I can solve this problem.
Yeah.
But that's arrogance, right? Like that's not true. Us by ourselves, we have one perspective, one brain, one set of ideas, one person's ability to solve problems or cast vision, rather than and maybe you're right. Maybe the people around you are not very good,
Sure.
but at least bad ideas could spark a good idea in you. You know what I mean? You'd be like, wow, that's a terrible idea, but it makes me think of a good one, right?
Yeah.
So that lack of collaboration just really narrows your vision. So that's good. All right. So then what's the solution to this? I know that in the God of the Valley kind of a little sermonette series, you talked about the immanence of God, right? So how does the immanence of God affect isolation in the context of leadership? And maybe first, like what is God's immanence?
Yeah. So, theologians talk about God in a lot of different ways, but one of the main ways they talk about him is in his transcendence and in his immanence. And so what that means is that his transcendence, he is high and above his creation. His immanence, he is near to his creation. He's not a deistic God who's just far off and just kind of letting the world tick, but he is near to his creation. And so God's immanence is just his nearness. And there's no more consistent promise in the Bible than God's promise to be with us. And our realm of leadership is not excluded from his presence and from his help. And so because of that, leadership no longer becomes the place that I must protect myself or prove myself, but rather it becomes a place in which even in leadership, and I don't know if we have a lot of experience with this, but even in vocational leadership, we are able to sense God's presence, to sense his nearness to our work, that he cares about what we're leading in and he is near to us in it. And so God's immanence can help us in our leadership because we see that isolation isn't really an option.
Yeah.
That we're not collaborating with God in the same way that we're collaborating with coworkers, but he is near to us and he cares about what we're doing in such a way that he wants to help. And so isolation kind of becomes a false story. And so that's how I think God's immanence really affects us. And then God is not only immanent in his manifest presence in our leadership or in the world, but he's also near to us through the church. The Bible's really clear that a Christian has been indwelt by the Holy Spirit. So that means that for me, in my leadership, I can always go to a trusted Christian friend, and in a way, they are the embodiment of God's nearness to me because they're by the Spirit that is in them, they're going to slowly help me and lead me down the right path. And so God is never far away. We know he's omnipresent. We say that really easily, but God's omnipresence doesn't just happen because he's God, but we forget that God, wherever God is where he intends to be. And so every place in our leadership is a place where we can meet God's presence and nearness with some real help.
Yeah. And you're right to say that we don't collaborate with God the same way we collaborate with the team. And we do collaborate with God in a number of different ways, or he collaborates with us, right?
Yeah.
So there does seem to be a common denominator here in that if, the same thinking or the same convictions that would cause you to isolate from people would also cause you to isolate from God and cut you off from God, right? Because that same arrogance of I can handle it, I can do it. It's better if it's just me. It's not hard to see how that would cut you off, not just from your teammates, but also cut you off from God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so it's not hard then to see that the solution to the problem of cutting yourself off or isolating yourself from teammates would be first making sure that you are connected to God and opening yourself up to relationship with God and not isolating from it and seeing the value of that and then letting that flow out into your relationships.
Yeah.
So that's good. All right. So then what's actionable? What are we doing to solve this problem? What are actions we need to take to refuse being isolated in our leadership?
I think the first one is really obvious, is wherever you are isolated right now, like this week, think about a project, think about an idea that you are working on right now. And then think about whoever is near to you in your organization or in your group that can give you valuable feedback and insight into what you're trying to do. Force yourself to collaborate with those who are around you in whatever you are leading on. Just don't allow isolation to be a thing. And so I think that's probably the most practical, is just to start collaborating. And then also I would say just begin to, and this isn't maybe quite as practical, but really begin to change the way that you're thinking about your leadership, and see that what you just said, that we are not doing this alone, no matter whether we have coworkers around or not. We're not doing this alone. We are doing this with the help and presence of God. Reinstitute a sense of wonder in your work, that you are partnering with God in the cultural mandate and moving the world forward in the good of creation that He's given it.
Yeah. One of the common denominators in great leaders that I know is that they listen to people who have no business speaking into their lives, or speaking, giving ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of particular leaders. Andy Crouch is one. Andy Crouch is an author and leader and thinker. Great. I mean, one of my really favorite authors alive today.
Yeah.
And I see him in podcast situations, in interview situations, where people suggest ideas that are, elementary compared to what he's thinking through. And man, he always takes the time to consider it, to learn from it, to integrate it into his thinking in a way that just communicates humility.
Yeah.
And if arrogance is in many ways at the core of this, one of the most important things we can do is repent.
Yeah.
Right? Repent of our arrogance and the presumption that we're better off by ourselves.
Yeah,
and to be able to walk forward in humility, knowing we need period, but we need people specifically.
Yeah.
So that's great. Well, I hope this is helpful for those of you who feel tempted to isolate in times of stress, to just, put the whole thing on your back. Let me just encourage you by saying, you're not that strong. You're not that good. You're not that smart. Don't overestimate yourself, because in the process, you cut yourself off from the real power of the presence of God and the community of God's people. So I want to encourage you by reminding you of your weakness. Because it is by acknowledging our weakness that we turn to a God who is strong. So hope this is helpful for you. Again, this is week 4. Join us next week. You can get this podcast. Wherever you got this podcast, you can get the next one. iTunes, Spotify, and all the other spots. We love you guys. We love leaders, and we think healthy leaders make great teams, great organizations, great churches. And so we do this happily for you. So have a great week, and hopefully we will see you next week.